Hi guys, so this is the recording for the PowerPoint for week 10 on Baraka's Dutchman. Um, as you guys all know, if you've watched the video or seen the performance, it's quite a challenging play. It's a play with quite radical politics, and it's also a play, it's a violent piece of theatre, and yeah, it's not something that we should take lightly, but at the same time, I think it's something which is very interesting, and it's certainly Baraka is one of the major playwrights of the 20th century, especially in America, and one of the major poets of the 20th century too. So I wanted you guys to be familiar with his work a little bit. So, okay, Amiri Baraka, known as Leroy Jones, at the time that he wrote Dutchman. Dutchman is a one-act play, first performed in 1964 and made into a film, which you guys have the link for in eCampus in 1967. And the play takes place on the New York subway and features two characters that are kind of smaller characters, but none of them have major speaking roles. But there are some characters in the background, but the two main characters are Clay, a young African American man, and Lula, who is a young white woman. And it consists almost entirely of a intensely virtuous conversation between the two characters. The conversation starts, as you'll see, when Clay sees Lula through the window of the subway, and she then kind of comes in and starts flirting with him quite heavily, and they kind of strike up a conversation and almost have a relationship at points in the film, just throughout the points in the film or the play, just throughout the duration of the subway journey itself. And a major part of what Lula does with Clay is that she's kind of able to read aspects of his personality and aspects of his history, and she makes these kind of assumptions, which in some ways are quite in some ways are quite kind of flirtatious throughout the play, but also become increasingly aggressive and increasingly seemingly intended to demean Clay and to undermine him. And she makes these assumptions based on the fact that he appears to be a kind of young black man with something like middle class aspirations. Like, he's reading, he has a suit, he just seems to be kind of living a normal life. And part of the situation that Clay is in the play, which we'll explore as the narrative goes on, concerns the way in which he's denied this capacity to live something like a kind of normal life and to pass unrecognized, because of his skin color and because of the politics of America at the time that the play was written. And Baraka is obviously very committed to exposing these politics, or to the political situation in America. So Lula alternates between flirting with Clay and taunting him, demonstrating that she's able to guess the kind of college that he attended and also the kind of friends that he has and the way in which he thinks of himself, while also insisting that she take him to the party to which she figures out he's traveling. And at other points in the play, they engage in a kind of mutually consensual fantasy about how they will spend their time together. We'll look at this a bit more later on, but they have this kind of conversation at the start of the second scene where they talk about what they're going to do, and it all kind of seems like it's leading up to sex, but then it kind of doesn't. Eventually, however, Clay breaks when Lula starts kind of performing and taunting and doing this kind of racist performance where she talks about a belly rub, which would be a kind of almost like a sexualized minstrel show, if you guys know what that means, when white people would impersonate African American people on stage. At this point, Clay gives a very passionate, at points very violent speech, in which he kind of finally asserts himself, in which he snaps, he becomes very angry, He talks about what it's like being black in America at that time. He talks about the appropriation of artists like Charlie Parker. He talks about the kind of anger that he feels and that he's forced to deal with every day because of the kind of reality of racism. And then he ends with this kind of quite apocalyptic, but also quite justified, or the reason, the rationale of the speech gives this kind of justified, rational vision of a kind of violence that will inevitably have to be enacted. Um, at that point, it kind of feels like everything's calmed down once Clay stops speaking. He kind of calls off whatever flirtation was happening with Lula previously, and he makes to leave the subway at the next stop. And at that point, Lula stabs him in the chest unexpectedly, very shockingly for the audience. Clay's body is thrown from the train, and the play ends as another African American person, young African American man, enters the train, and you kind of get the sense that the situation might repeat itself. We'll talk about this right at the end, but there is quite a strong allegorical element to Dutchman, potentially, if you want to read it in that way. And it's worth thinking about what it might be. If it is intended as an allegory, it's worth thinking about what it might be an allegory of, because, yeah, it's an open question as to how clear that is, but there's certainly the potential for an allegorical reading of Dutchman. So just a bit of background about Baraka, a bit more background about Baraka, which bears on the play directly. So Baraka wrote the play shortly after he relocated to Greenwich Village, which, if you guys know, is on the lower west side of Manhattan Island in New York City. It's a traditionally bohemian area. It's where Bob Dylan lived when he was young. It's where a number of poets lived, and not many of them live there anymore because it's so expensive to live in Greenwich Village now, but it's still got this kind of reputation for being a artistic center in New York City. And Baraka was married when he lived there. He had begun to establish something of a reputation as a poet, and he made the choice to move to Harlem, which was a much poorer area, primarily African American area in the north of New York City, the north of Manhattan Island, as a result of his involvement in black nationalist politics, what would be called black nationalist politics, and his desire to pursue art and theatre that was specifically oriented towards the American black working class. And this theatre, as you'll see if you read the quite strange and surreal, but also at points very poetic and brilliant essay that I've uploaded on the revolutionary theatre. This theatre was intended to shock, but also to help African American people, especially in America, understand the kind of structures and racisms and contradictions that were determining how their lives were being lived, and encouraging them to understand that they had the power to change those circumstances through kind of collective action. And yeah, in the short essay, the Revolutionary Theatre, Baraka writes that this theatre that he had in mind would accuse and that it would attack the way in which society was organized, and that these attacks would be aimed at awakening action in people who witnessed them. As the essay also makes clear, Baraka felt that radical social change could only come about through mass agency of African Americans. The essay is written so, just to give you a little bit more context about Baraka, he's usually understood to have had what's called a black nationalist period, of which Dutchman would be a part, and of which the Revolutionary Theatre essay is a part as well. He later went on to develop a more kind of Marxist analysis of racism, which was less based around this kind of notion of African American exceptionalism and of the need to divorce essentially black life from a white class which was oppressing and was kind of the source of racism, and more focused on a kind of Marxist class-based economic analysis of the situation. So while Baraka remained committed to social justice throughout his entire life, he did change the kind of terms that he's using in order to articulate his politics throughout his life. And if we look at the Revolutionary Theatre essay and we also look at Dutchman, we're dealing with a point in Baraka's writing life in which he's very influenced by black nationalism, in which he has yet to develop a kind of Marxist economic analysis of social change and society in general. So let's talk about Dutchman in general. In the Revolutionary Theatre essay, Baraka explicitly describes Clay as a victim. We can see this here down at the bottom. Clay in Dutchman, Ray in the Toilet, Walker in the Slaves. These are all other plays that Baraka wrote. They're all victims. In the Western sense, they could be heroes. But the revolutionary theatre, even if it is Western, must be anti-Western. So if we follow the logic of this argument, there's a sense in which Clay is a hero. There's a sense in which he's the protagonist of the play. There's a sense in which he has heroic qualities. There's a sense in which he's a kind of a good person in some ways, or at least he's trying to be a good person as much as the world in which he exists will allow him to. But Baraka also wants to insist that he's a victim. And it's worth thinking carefully, I think, about what it is that he's a victim of and in what way he might be both a victim and a hero, and what Baraka means when he says that he's a victim, but in the Western sense, he might be a hero. So, in one basic sense, Clay is the victim of Lula's violence. He's literally killed by her at the end of the play, and before this, he's also a victim of her assumptions regarding his character, his desires, and his personal history. And it's clear from the opening of the play, which you'll see if you watch the film or you read the script, that Lula is able to read Clay exceptionally well, even down to being able to guess the physical appearance of the friend whose party he is traveling to. So Lula she's never wrong about anything that she says about Clay, but then the question is, what does it say about her and about society in general that she can be so right? And we might be tempted to say that the fact that Lula is able to read Clay in this way simply means that she's perhaps very good at understanding people. She might be one of these people, and they do exist, who are just very good at reading people, who are very good at observing what someone's physical appearance and their mannerisms say about the kind of person they are and the kind of life that they've led. Those people do exist. But at the same time, there is something about her skill, or something about her skill also reveals something about what it means to be African American at the time that the play was written. And I think it reveals two things, or we could argue that it reveals two things. Number one, it reveals the fact that young African American men were, in some ways, or young African American women, young African American people in general in the world of the play, are kind of already objectified. So they're treated as if they are there to be commented on, or they are there to be read by people who want to make intelligent and witty observations about them. And that's already kind of an assumed form of domination, I think, at least within the world of the play itself. At the same time, as well as this, the fact that Lula is able to read Clay kind of so effectively in one way or another also suggests that his options in some ways are kind of limited, and what she says about him is as much a reflection of the fact that he embodies a kind of ideal towards which middle class intellectual black men might have sought to strive. But we can also say that that ideal is just it's just based on the fact that there weren't many options, you know. Um, so yeah, he's young and Clay is young and black at a time when opportunities for young men like him and young women like him would have been severely restricted. And Lula's judgments about him, such as her capacity to guess the kind of college which he attended, sorry, that should say he, not her, um, don't reveal more than a surface level understanding of some of the basic facts about social reality. So when she's able to say that, I guess you kind of went to a college for African American people. I mean, very few colleges, even in 1964, would have allowed non-white students or allowed black students. As we saw in Du Bois, at the time that Black Reconstruction was written, Princeton, Ivy League universities weren't letting in black students. So the fact that Lula is able to guess this about Clay doesn't say a huge amount um, that we didn't already know and that the audience wouldn't already know to some degree. Not every university was segregated in the US, but a lot of them were, so it doesn't say all that much, you know. Um, and as I say, Lula deliberately exoticizes Clay, reminds him that he's black, even as she's kind of showing this overwhelming interest in him. So he's there to be objectified by her, and he's also there to be commented on by her. And this is a kind of racialized judgment. She doesn't go and comment on the appearance of any of the other travelers on the subway. And the way that Lula treats Clay kind of continually reminds him of his existence as an African American. Although he appears to kind of genuinely enjoy her attention, Lula, through this kind of continuous reminding, which at times is kind of playful, and then later on in the play becomes much more openly aggressive and openly racist, becomes very aggressively racist when she begins the performance of the belly rub and when she talks about slavery. This, we can argue, kind of represents more of a general social trend, which Baraka is wanting to draw attention to. And then we have the kind of final part of the contradiction, which is that not only does Lula insist on Clay's blackness, she also accuses him of being an Uncle Tom or a Tom, which was a derogatory word for a African American person who, in some way, was considered to have sold out. So to have abandoned their black heritage and essentially to have um, sided with the oppressor in some form or another. And obviously, not everyone would have used that terminology, but if you were using it to describe someone, you would be using it to describe someone who was quite self interested, who had ceased to resist the oppressive forces of the racist society in the US and who had just tried to get on by. Um, which in some ways is what Clay is doing, but at the same time, he's kind of Lula's comments on him. They place him in this situation in which he's either condemned for being black and for having the history of slavery as playing a role in his life, or he's condemned for being an Uncle Tom, which in some ways she even suggests is worse, and which Baraka might have thought was worse as well. But the point for Clay is that there's no way out for him. He's both a victim of Lula's interruptions, of her attention, of her insults, and he's also a victim of the fact that there's no way that he can get away from being either a Tom or being black. There's no alternative um, within the world of the play. And it's interesting, I think, that it's the accusation that Clay is too middle class, that he's abandoned his roots, which really causes him to snap. That and Lula's kind of dancing and performance of him. Um, and in the final speech that Clay gives, we really see the kind of anger that he lives with, and his kind of we see a kind of assertion of himself that Clay hasn't given at any other point in the play. And we see a kind of vision of his life, which is one of um, almost continually repressed anger, and of needing to repress his anger. And we see that it's when it first comes out, it's deeply violent. Um, and I'm not saying that Baraka is necessarily saying that this violence is a good idea, and I definitely don't think that a modern audience would respond to Clay's speech as if it was a serious political thing to do. But it's there in the play, and it's an expression of the amount of kind of necessarily repressed anger that Clay has towards a society which is continually judging him. So he says, I could rip that Times out of his hand. He's talking about another passenger on the train. As skinny and middle class as I am, I would rip that paper out of his hand and just as easily rip out his throat. It takes no great effort for what to kill you soft idiots. He starts to assert himself, and he starts to accuse Lula of being someone who takes advantage of a certain image of African American men in order to increase her own image of herself, or in order to gain something. And again, he uses misogynist language here, evidently as well. So again, this isn't something that I think that necessarily Baraka, or certainly a modern audience, would view as being a positive expression in any way. And then he starts talking about art. He starts talking about Charlie Parker, who was the great jazz saxophonist. Baraka was also a great music critic, and wrote several books which were very influential about the history of jazz. He knew Charlie Parker, I think, or maybe he was a bit after Charlie Parker, but he was around the jazz scene in New York, and he was a very great jazz journalist. And he draws this kind of contradiction between the way that jazz and the way that African American people are exoticized and intellectualized by a white audience, and kind of what he thinks he hears in their music. So he says, Charlie Parker, all the hip white boys scream for Bird. Bird was Charlie Parker's nickname. And Bird saying, up your ass, feeble-minded Ofe, up your ass. And they sit there talking about the tortured genius of Charlie Parker. So there's this kind of, Clay views this kind of dissonance between the way that African American artists like Charlie Parker, what it is that they're expressing, the kind of violence of their lives, and what it means to be black in America, which feeds into their music and how people think of it. And he says, Bird would have played not a note of music if he just walked up to East 67th Street and killed the first 10 white people he saw. Not a note. So this is the speech of someone who's quite desperate, the speech of someone who is not someone who the audience can necessarily really relate to at this point. But what he's saying is that the kind of art that we associate, or that one might associate with African Americans at this period, is built on a really powerfully repressed sense of rage, essentially. And whether we agree with that or not is a different question. But definitely jazz. And if you listen, I don't know if you guys know Charlie Parker, but if you listen to this music, it's very wild, it's very frenetic, it's got a huge amount of energy in it. Um, and what Clay is suggesting is that part of this energy, part of what drives this, is this kind of desire for violence that obviously can't be realized in society, but at the same time is based on real experiences of oppression, of racial injustice, which Charlie Parker and Clay and Baraka and millions of other people lived and live with every day. And then it ends, we'll pick it up here, um, with this: don't make the mistake. So he's talking to Lula at this point, and he says, don't make the mistake through some irresponsible surge of Christian charity of talking too much about the advantages of Western rationalism or the great intellectual legacy of the white man. Or maybe they'll begin to listen. They is African American people. Sorry. Page. Oh, there we go. Then maybe one day you'll find they actually do understand exactly what you are talking about. All these fantasy people, all these blues people. So all these fantasy people, this sense that a certain kind of white middle class has this image of what African American people are, especially what African American artists are, and they use this to construct this kind of this kind of imaginary race of interesting, as exoticized blues people, people who sing blues, people who are melancholy, people who have a certain beauty. But this is all a fantasy, and it's a violent fantasy because it's a fantasy that reinforces racial prejudices and reinforces relations of power. And what Clay is saying is that he says they'll murder you and have very rational explanations, very much like your own. They'll cut your throats and drag you out to the edge of your cities so the flesh can fall away from your bones in sanitary isolation. So again, it's an extremely violent image, but it's an image which Clay at this point in the play, and I think Baraka at this point in his life, even though he would later use different language, wants to talk about the kind of rationality of a kind of violence, of a kind of defensive violence, and of a kind of violent revenge, which has been bred not only through the violence of slavery and through the violence of racism, but also through the kind of violence of something like a white imaginary, like the exoticization continually of African American people by those people who, by white people, by the more privileged people in America. And again, this is a very Baraka. At this point, he's working in very, very clear binaries. We can say this isn't something that he would necessarily hold on to, and it's by no means something that we need to hold on to. But at the time the play was written, and for a long time afterwards, these kind of conversations were happening, and this kind of sense in America that not only did black emancipation depend on some kind of mass action, but that violence might need to be a part of that. This was something that was talked about very commonly, at least in intellectual and in artistic circles amongst African American communities and authors. And there is a kind of sense that Martin Luther King and peaceful protest was the biggest part of both the civil rights movement and conversations around social justice in relation to race in America. And to an extent, that's true, but also to an extent, I think that we should the play needs us to pay attention and speaks to a tradition in which certain kinds of violence were, if not valorized, and I don't think the play is saying this would be a good thing necessarily at all, but I think what Baraka is saying is that there is a kind of rational quality to the kind of vengeance that Clay imagines at this point, when he's really been pushed to the limit by Lula and when he's really been taunted and mocked and, stripped of any patience that remained, is what happens at the final, and yeah, in the final moments of the play when he gives this speech. So Clay's speech is violent and fiercely proud. It reflects Baraka's own belief in violence itself as a potential part of meaningful political change. We don't have to agree with that belief, but we can't deny the fact that it was important for Baraka. And at the same time, it's not necessarily a speech which we want to agree with, even if we can understand where it's coming from. It's misogynist. Clay says he would rip Lula's breasts off at one point. And it's futile. It's sexist, it's misogynist, and it's futile. It's not going to do anything. And we also don't know that Clay really thinks this either, or that he would really support these actions in a more calm state. So we can also read the speech as being as much of an expression of victimhood and of frustration as it is of something of something real, or of a kind of vision that either the character or the playwright would want to make happen. And its futility, or the fact that it doesn't really present a solution, is made pretty clear in the final scene, in the final moment of the play, in which Lula stabs Clay, and then nobody appears to react very strongly, and she tells them to throw his body off the train, which they do. So, how do we react to Lula in this situation? One reading of her is that she's an antagonist in some way. She's a villain. She exploits Clay's desires for assimilation, as well as her own attractiveness, in order to toy with him. She forces him into rupturing his own peace, and then she kills him. And we can move from that reading to suggest that she is quite a thin, hollow, sexist stereotype of a typically manipulative and deceitful woman. And that might be the reading that we want to give of Lula's character, which would also, would definitely affect how we think about the play as a whole, if it has this kind of misogynist vision of a typically deceitful, untrustworthy woman at its heart. It would seem to make it a less interesting play, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of people. And it is worth noticing that Baraka was firmly attached to a specific kind of masculine strength. He was homophobic. He was, in lots of ways, he wasn't a very nice guy at all. And he had some views that I would not support, and that a lot of people would not support. So I don't think that we can rule out the misogynist element of Lula's characterization. And again, the fact that she's always eating apples, or she eats several apples in the play, also suggests that she is being related directly to the history of Eve, and to the fall, and to this kind of whole history of viewing women as tempting and also as destructive, and viewing this temptation as being destructive of men and of masculinity. However, I would still say, and other critics have said, that whatever even Baraka's intentions, there's still maybe more that we can say about Lula's character and about the situation of the play that Lula's character is involved in than than the fact that she's a misogynist stereotype. I think she is more than that. So she's clearly intelligent, and she's highly aware of the kind of conventions and limitations that structure her own life as a woman. And I think that this is interesting. It's not just that she is good at reading Clay, but she also knows exactly what is expected from her, and she toys with that too. So in the second scene, at the start of the second scene, which is here, we see them kind of talking, and we see they're talking about this party that they've decided they're going to go to. Clay was going there anyway, but now Lula's going to go too. And Lula just starts building this kind of fantasy, and most of it's believable, and Clay goes along with it. He says, I know it'll be something good. You can come in with me looking casual and significant. I'll be strange, haughty, and silent, and walk with long, slow strides. And Clay says, right. So Clay's on board at this point. You know, he's on board for most of the play, whether he wants to be or not. He finds her very attractive. And she says, when you get drunk, pat me once very lovingly on the flanks, so on the side of her leg. I'll look at you cryptically, licking my lips. Clay says, it sounds like something we can do. Then Lua says, you'll go around talking to young men about your mind and to old men about your plans. If you meet a very close friend who is also with someone like me, we can stand together sipping our drinks and exchanging codes of lust. The atmosphere will be slithering in love and half-love and very open moral decision. And Clay says, great, great. Then Lula says, and everyone will pretend they don't know your name, and then later, when they have to, they'll claim a friendship that denies you're still in character. So, not only is Clay going along with this, but Lula paints a kind of quite vivid picture of society, of a party, of a place in which Clay will know some people, but he won't know everyone, of a place in which she will be expected to behave in certain ways, and she's clearly very aware of this, and she's aware of the way in which she's sexualized. If you watch the film at this point, Clay is all over her. And yeah, we should remember as well that the exchange begins because Clay is staring at her through the window of the train and objectifying her. And Lula responds to this, and she very much takes over. But in some ways, she is not the initiator of their relationship. So it's not, all I mean by this is that if we read the play a bit more carefully, it's not just the case that Lula is this kind of figure who comes in and disrupts Clay's world. He, in some way, goes along with this, and he also arguably initiates it. So I would say one reading of Lula's character is that she fulfills the social expectations which many people would already hold about her. Her manipulations represent an attempt to claim some of the only power which is open to her as a single woman, something which she can only do by at least partly fulfilling the role and the behaviors that are expected of her. So while Clay tries to aspire to a certain kind of middle class life, which is still limited, but which he feels is open to him, Lula is more fluid and even more self-aware with the kinds of boundaries that are placed on her. It's like she knows that she may not have a real alternative in terms of the way that she herself is objectified, and she chooses one kind of way of responding to that is to become this kind of hypersexualized figure. And it's almost as if she takes out her frustration on Clay throughout the course of the play. Not to say that that is in any way justified, but we begin to see a bit more of a complex idea of her and why she behaves in the way in which she does, if we think about the way in which her own life is mediated by the fact that she's a woman in the way that Clay's life is mediated by the fact of his race. So, are they both victims then? Are both Clay and Lula victims of a kind of wider social context? For Clay, Lula may initially represent a flattering mutual attraction before she morphs into an embodiment of the social world, which simultaneously demands a conformity and insists that no actual behavior will be enough to exempt him from racist judgments. So, at the same time that Lula flatters him, she also attacks him, she undermines him, and she undermines him both because he's black and because he's striving towards a certain kind of middle classness. So she makes it clear that there's no way that he can win. For Lula, Clay represents an opportunity to exercise what little agency she has. It's clear from the way in which she runs through the narrative which she imagines for herself and Clay that Lula is fully aware of the possibilities of their relationship and the way in which her femininity assigns her a particular role within society. So she's also working in these kind of limitations. She has a very different approach to them, but they're both limited characters, and they're both characters who are not, whose agency is compromised because of either race or gender. And yet, Lula's use of the minstrel show is or reference to it through performance. The belly rub is the most, for Clay, is the thing that really pushes him over the edge. It's blazingly racist. It would be completely unacceptable in contemporary life for good reason. But at the same time, when we think about it, we can think about it's also a way in which perhaps Lula responds to her own kind of objectification and to her own sense of expectation, which is weighing on her as a woman. And in some way, maybe she takes it out on Clay, which again is not to justify her actions in any way. And I don't think the play wants us to justify her actions. But at the same time, there's a kind of psychology at work in those actions, which makes sense if we consider that Lula herself is also someone who is continually who people continually make assumptions about based on her appearance and based on the kind of person that she is supposed to be. So yeah, from one's perspective, the play is an allegory for race relations in the US. But it could also function as a kind of confrontation between two groups whose life to some degree is reduced to a kind of performance. Clay lives in a world which continually identifies him as black and that either attacks him for this or accuses him of having abandoned his heritage. As a young woman, Lula is stereotyped and exoticized. Sorry. It is clear that Lula is not intended to be a positive character, however, we can see that she is, in a different way, affected by problems of representation and assumptions about her character and behavior. Unlike Clay, she chooses to affirm these and to perform them to excess. So we can say that her way of dealing with this is not to keep her head down, but it's to embrace these kind of stereotypes and expectations, and through their excessive performance in some way to exercise a degree of control over them. Okay, guys, so task for this week. We haven't looked at much of the text of Dutchman, so I would like you to watch the film version, which is on eCampus. If you'd like to work on the play, then I suggest you also look at the PDF of the script that I've uploaded. And yeah, write down 5 sentences that for you describe Clay and Lula's relationship as it developed throughout the course of the play. Ask yourself also, is it useful to compare this relationship with any of the other couples we've seen on the course? As you watch the film, are you reminded of any of the other couples? And has this lecture or class or whatever given you any thoughts that you think might be interesting to compare Clay and Lula with any of the other couples that we've spoken about? Okay, so for the catch-up session, I would like you to consider whether or not we can read the play allegorically. So, do we think of Dutchman as an allegory? He describes the baraka, the stage directions at the start of the play, say the subway is heaped in modern myth. So, do we think the play should be read allegorically? And the title Dutchman refers to Wagner's opera The Flying Dutchman, about a ghostly ship which must sail the seas forever. What relevance, if any, does this myth have for the story that Baraka tells in this play? So, do we want to A, can you read the play allegorically, and B, can you understand any possible meaning that the myth of the Flying Dutchman might hold for the play? And I'm just going to delete this now because it's I was going to put a song by Baraka and a band that Baraka played in, but you don't need to listen to that. I'll finish this question though. Sorry, I obviously didn't quite type this out properly. Do you think the play is an allegory? I mean, you've all heard me say this, but whatever. Okay, guys. So go back to the slideshow. Don't play from start. Play from current slide. Okay. So yeah, have a think about this. I hope that you got something out of Dutchman. Next week is the last week, but you've still got time to think about your orals and think about your written assessments. So get in touch with me if you have any questions about anything. The final catch-up session is on Monday, so I'll look forward to talking to some of you then. If you can't make it, then by all means, as always, email me and let me know any questions that you would have asked that you weren't able to. And yeah, take care. I hope that you're enjoying the course and speak to you on Monday.